Welcome everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We're going to give you a little bit of an update on the Florida State against ACC battle, some big news out of that case that we will break down for you all. Then we got some spring game reactions, tons of spring games this past Saturday that I want to break down for y'all. Then we'll get into some transfer portal news. See what some top teams need in the transfer portal this upcoming cycle, and then we'll finish it off with a Good Vibes Monday, and we'll talk about the UFL and the opportunity for college football players to live out their dream in the UFL. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here. Maybe you can ask something that you've been wondering for a while. You can use the link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of an interactive experience here, and it's always fun for both of us, I think. But let's jump right in and let's talk about Florida State. There has been a huge battle between them and the ACC going on for quite some time now. It started when the playoff committee left Florida State out, and they saw kind of the hierarchy that was forming around college football, and they decided to take action. They sued the ACC, and the ACC sued them right back, and they are going at it over their grant of rights, and Florida State's trying to get out of the conference before the end of their media deal in 2036, so tons going on there, tons to keep track of, but one of the big things that has been going on is when Florida State filed their lawsuit against the ACC, they filed it in Florida. When the ACC filed their lawsuit back against Florida State, they filed it in North Carolina. And that has been kind of a big battle throughout this entire diatribe that we've gone through with the ACC and Florida State, and now Clemson in on the party. One of the big things in both of these cases is where is it going to be tried? Where are they going to be able to hear this case, in North Carolina or in Florida? Because as we all know, home field advantage means quite a bit. And I think that's kind of the big thing that we've been kind of watching the most, at least in the short term here, when we talk about this case, and it seems like the ACC has won that. It looks like a North Carolina judge denied two motions filed by Florida State to dismiss or stay a lawsuit from the ACC, so essentially this would likely make it so North Carolina courts would be the one that hears this case, not Florida courts, which obviously is a big deal. The ACC being headquartered in North Carolina, having a lot of relationships around North Carolina can only help them, and being in Florida would only really hurt them. When you have Florida State fans, when you have all of this other stuff going on in Florida, it's a big deal to have this be tried in North Carolina for them, so absolutely huge. What's at stake is obviously that $500 million plus exit fee that Florida State is trying to get out of. I believe it's somewhere around $572 million, is I believe what I read yesterday, and then 130 of that is drawn from TV revenue. So this is going to be quite the lawsuit and a lot of stuff to break down, and Florida State will be fighting tooth and nail, obviously, to not have to fork over all that cash, because it's quite an insane amount of money, especially when you're in a conference that, while not at the top of the food chain anymore by any means, is still in the conversation, right? Is still a part of all these debates in college football, and while they're running third right now, at least they're in third. At least they're in the race. So I think Florida State is in a position where, for the time being, if that's going to be the cost, they are not going anywhere. Now, the good thing for Florida State is one of the things in this contract, or in their media deal, the ACC with ESPN, is once 2027 hits, the ESPN essentially has full rights to cut that off. They have the ability to essentially exercise a 9-year option that would go through 2036 if they decide to decline that option and do away with that deal with the conference. That number becomes a lot lower for Florida State and for Clemson and for whoever else is looking to join, because as we know, there are a ton of people watching this from the sidelines, whether it's Miami or North Carolina or Virginia. All of these schools are definitely watching this very, very closely, and I think in 2027 might be the time to strike. And obviously that's not at all what Florida State fans want to hear. They don't want to be in this conference that much longer, but at the end of the day, I think the goal of Florida State and Clemson at this point, or at least in my eyes, has got to be get as many schools involved, get as many lawsuits on the ACC's hands as possible, put them in a position where when 27 rolls around, or maybe even a little bit earlier, depending on where the ACC is at and how amenable they are, although I don't think they'll be too flexible with Florida State and Clemson throughout this process, but make it so where in 2027 ESPN's decision is very easy and they kind of just let the ACC fall by the wayside. That number comes down significantly from the current 572 million, and you can probably move forward much easier. So I think this is a very interesting thing because Florida State and Clemson, as we've kind of gotten into these cases a little bit more detail, Florida State is fighting because they believe the ACC has not done a good job of keeping up with the college football world, especially from a media rights perspective. They signed the deal all the way back in 2016, and had it run for 20 years, up to 2036 hypothetically. So this is obviously a contract that, even when they signed it, was a little bit crazy because unless it has a remarkable amount of adjustment in the middle of that contract for the changing times and for how other conferences are getting compensated, they were always going to lose money on this deal. They were always going to be behind the eight ball when this time came, when these conferences like the SEC, the Big Ten, become more and more powerful, and the Big 12 is not lacking at all for good leadership and a good media deal. So I think the ACC kind of handcuffed themselves back in 2016, and ever since then has been kind of trying their best to create a good atmosphere for their schools, but the playoff kind of blew that up last year, and Florida State obviously was not happy with the way that they felt the ACC was on the pecking order. They didn't feel great about the media deal. They didn't feel great about just where the ACC sat in the grand scheme of things. So I think them deciding to sue the ACC makes sense. I think it created a lot of craziness around college football, but at the end of the day, Florida State is fighting about media rights. Now, Clemson is fighting kind of a different type of battle. They believe that the grant of rights, the exit fee, is far too much. I believe 130 million, like we were just talking about, is far too much for them to pay to get out of the conference. So it's kind of an interesting diatribe where you get into these two cases, and although they're filed against the same entity and they're from two schools that have the same motivation and have the same goal at the end of the day, they fight from two different angles, essentially. They're coming from two different angles at the conference, which obviously is the best way to go about things. When you're suing people, especially someone with the power that the ACC has or that any of these conferences have, the best way to do it is just put a ton on their plate, right? Put as many different cases, as many different arguments on their plate as possible, and then see where the chips fall type of thing. So I think Clemson and Florida State are kind of in an interesting position where they're fighting for the same thing, but they're not fighting the same battle necessarily. They're not fighting the same arguments. They will not be going from the same direction in these battles. And I think that bodes well for these teams getting out of the conference, but not sure how well it bodes in terms of getting more to jump in, because obviously you don't want to have someone else jump in on under the same argument of Florida State or the same argument of Clemson, because then you can group them together, and the ACC has a much better way to kind of handle this. So it'll be interesting to see what Miami might come in with, or what North Carolina might come in with, because both those schools, I'm sure, are watching this very closely. And while Miami, I talked about last week, might not be quite as inclined, I think North Carolina is the one where, if that happens, a lot of things happen very quickly, because that's the one where we've been talking about this home field battle. We've talked about home field advantage in terms of where this case is tried. The ACC would lose that immediately when North Carolina joins the party. So the ACC is kind of in this nightmare situation. Obviously, it's not where you want to be if you're the ACC. Probably not where you thought you would be towards the end of last season, when Florida State was making this incredible run and going undefeated and in the playoff discussion. You probably didn't think you were in danger of the entire conference falling apart, not, 6 months later from that. So obviously a lot going on around the ACC. I think they've done a really, really good job of handling all this, just because of how crazy of a situation it is and how nightmare of a situation it ended up being. I don't think they ever thought that the two schools that, at least from a football perspective, are the most valuable to them are now fighting them. I don't think that's something that they expected. Now they've had to deal with it, and being able to get this on North Carolina soil for the battle is absolutely huge. So it'll be really interesting to see how all of this develops. I talked about earlier, more teams are going to get involved, and that only helps Florida State and Clemson as long as these arguments are not super similar to the other two, because that just adds to the plate of the ACC. That just adds to the confusion, adds to the uncertainty around the league, and then ESPN starts watching a little bit closely. So I think that's the ultimate goal of these two schools, is really just get as many people involved as quickly as possible, because it might just spell a quicker exit from the ACC and unfortunately, a quicker demise for the ACC. But I think from the ACC's perspective, the goal is always, in these cases, and especially in one like this, just elongate this as long as you can. To be totally honest, their media deal with ESPN has basically a addendum in it that would make it entirely void, where if the ACC is not above, or is not at 15 teams or above, ESPN agreement is entirely void, and then everything gets bad very, very quickly. So the ACC is in kind of a position where you need to kick this can as far down the road as you possibly can. You need to argue this tooth and nail, go from every single direction, get as many recesses as you possibly can, elongate this, because there are teams out there looking for a lifeline. And while the ACC, as we talked about earlier, is not necessarily the greatest lifeboat in the world, it's still one that's, above water right now, where if you're the group of 5 team, you just saw the Super League just get introduced and pitched out to everyone, and you know that in a lot of ways you would be getting squeezed out. So a lot of teams are looking for a chance to get into that party, a chance to at least have a shot to save their program and be in on the conversation, and the ACC needs them. So Clemson and Florida State, I've said time and again, I think they're gone. I don't think there was any question. I think the second that they filed these motions against the school, they were out the door. And that's unfortunate, but that's just kind of the way that college football works nowadays. But at the end of the day, there are tons of schools out there that also want out of their conference, frankly, or at least might not actively want out, but if the ACC comes calling, they will in a hurry. So I think there's tons of teams they can choose from. I think there's tons of ways they can go about it, but you have to act relatively quickly, because the Pac-12 is sitting over there with Oregon State and Washington State, and they're just kind of watching this unfold. They're hoping that the ACC falls short and they can start to poach some ACC teams, but if that doesn't happen, if the ACC is able to elongate this and add App State and Troy and JMU and some different teams and kind of build out this conference a little bit more and make it so you have no danger of falling below 15 teams. And not only that, you have more power to keep everyone else other than Clemson and Florida State in the conference. I think you then have more negotiating power, and you can go to maybe even Oregon State and Washington State and say, we already have Cal and Stanford over here, you might as well come on over. So there's two real different ways that this could go in my mind. I think the ACC thus far has been handling this very well, so I think this will be elongated for quite some time. I think this is kind of the point when everything starts to slow down. Once the case is really starting to be tried is when things really move at a molasses type pace. But at the end of the day, the ACC has a ton of really big decisions ahead of them, especially over the next couple of months, and they're going to need to act very quickly, very decisively, and if they don't, it could mean the end of the ACC. So it's a lot of moving parts here. There's going to be a lot more updates on this, because Clemson is another one that they have to decide where they're going to try it. Now, this would make me think that Clemson is probably going to get the same fate that Florida State did, and this will be tried in North Carolina as well. But who knows? Maybe Clemson is fighting from a little bit better of a standing, and maybe they're able to pull it off. But obviously, a huge win for the ACC in this battle. I think it only helps them elongate this process and give them another fighting shot. Obviously, not the place they want to be, not the place they expected to be, but all things considered, with all of the things that have gone wrong for them this offseason, I think this is something that is going right, and as long as you make the right choices from here on out, it can go right for quite some time. So, huge update there. The ACC will continue to work on that and continue to kind of build out that case, and I will keep you updated as those cases kind of be tried. But for the time being, the ACC looks like they're on, somewhat stable footing as everything around them crumbles. At the very least, they have done what they can to stay upright, and then we'll see what happens from here. But we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some spring games. Clemson, NC State, and Auburn were all in action this Saturday, so I want to break down some of the big takeaways from that and some of the guys that have really jumped onto the scene for all these teams right after this.